Hello, my friends. It's that time of week when we do some sacred reading together. Now, if you've been watching over a period of time, you know we just finished the first letter of John, and we're now in our second week of reading Ruth. You can do Lectio Divina or sacred reading on any kind of text that you want to, any kind of sacred text that you choose. There are some differences. When you're doing like the letter that we were doing before, it often makes kinds of declarations and statements that then you can kind of look for in your heart. When we're reading the book of Ruth, it's a story. And so sometimes it matters that you remember some of the names that are involved to help you in the process. So if you weren't with us for our first week of Ruth, I just want you to remember some key players in this. There was a man, and his name was Elimelech, and he had a wife whose name was Naomi, and they had two sons who were Mahlon and probably Kihlon, although it might be Chilon. I mean, probably you would pronounce it that way in English. And they have gone into another country because there's a famine at home. So they've moved to Moab. And don't want to go into any more depth. If you don't know what sacred reading is, and this is your first time joining us, sacred reading is reading a text that is sacred to us with the anticipation that in some way Spirit will speak through the text and into us what we need to hear right now. It's not just about trying to figure out what the original writer meant. It's listening for a word, a phrase, or perhaps an image that arises for us that can encourage us. It can call us out. It can awaken us to a reality we might have missed somewhere else. It can do any number of things when it speaks to us. Now, when I do sacred reading on my own, I read the text out loud 3 times. I do that for a variety of reasons. Part of it, though, is so that it's not just read with my eyes and going into my brain. Sometimes the eyes can play tricks and skip over things or fix things, but when you read them out loud, you can hear them. And it also involves your body, not just your mind. It involves your body because you're a whole person. I'm a whole person. So I like to read it out loud, and I encourage you, if you do sacred reading, to do the same thing. You don't have to. I'm just encouraging you to do it. I think it makes a difference. All of the texts in most sacred texts were originally spoken aloud and passed down in the oral tradition before they became written, particularly the older texts. So I encourage you to let the words speak to you aloud and bring whatever questions, whatever arises in you as you read it. Now, when we do sacred reading together here in these moments, I read the text aloud only once. You can stop it right then. You can go and pull out your own copy of, in this case, the Bible, and look up the book of Ruth, and you can read those same verses aloud yourself if you want, to yourself. Or you can hang on. There's a pause after I read it once, and then I reflect on what I heard the text saying. It's not the only thing that the text may say. It's the thing that the text is speaking to me right then, and what I think I need to hear. And so I share it with you, kind of as an example of how a text might speak to us. If you get something out of the thing I say, great. And if you don't, you can always just skip listening for that. But today we are reading from Ruth chapter 1. We pick up with verse 3, and we're working our way down to verse 6 in the first chapter. So I've introduced the characters, And perhaps we're going to hear some more about those same characters as we read today. Soon afterward, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi and the 2 sons to fend for themselves. The 2 sons eventually married 2 Moabite women, whose names were Orpah and Ruth. They had lived in the land of Moab for about 10 years when both Mahlon and Chilion died. Now that Naomi had lost both her children as well as her husband, she prepared to take her daughters-in-law and leave the land of Moab and return to her homeland, for she had heard that the Lord had visited the people by providing an abundance of food. So, here are my thoughts. What struck me when I read the text? And it was the very last line. There were lots of good things in there. What happens sometimes when we go somewhere else to figure out, to try to establish ourselves somewhere else, to move on from the things that no longer serve us. But what really spoke to me is that last line, that the Lord had visited the people in her homeland by providing an abundance of food. What I heard echoed there is something that I think we sometimes forget, that in our lives, when things go a certain way, we experience life. Something good happened to the people back in Israel. And when that something good happened, they experienced it as a visit from the Lord. I mean, did you hear those words? For Naomi had heard that the Lord had visited the people by providing an abundance of food. We often think of the Lord visiting us in other kinds of ways, and certainly in the biblical text, oftentimes the Lord visits in all sorts of unusual ways. There's a burning bush somewhere that doesn't get consumed, and there the Lord is speaking aloud, or perhaps on a mountaintop when we're speaking aloud, or even at the baptism of Jesus, we hear a voice echoing from the sky. That is one of the ways that God shows up. But God also shows up to Elijah in a still small voice. So God can appear in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that God appears, or certainly that God appears here, is they saw the abundance of food after the famine as an appearance of God. So I began to wonder to myself, what places is God showing up in my life that I'm completely missing? Because I think God shows up when somebody talks to me, a loud booming voice maybe from the sky, or where am I missing that God is already showing up? Just a question to ponder. Where might God be showing up in my life that I'm missing? In the songs of the bird in the morning, when I look out the window and the sun is shining and it's brighter. This morning when I sat down for coffee at about my normal time with my wife Linda, and I noticed that outside the sun was out. And up until recently, it was dark at the time that we were sitting there. So for me, uh, we can notice that God shows up in interesting places. In this text, in the abundance of food, they recognize God's presence in that. Sometimes it's in a still small voice, it's in a silence, it's in lots of places. God can be heard and God shows up in our lives. And so I guess for me, and maybe for you, I encourage us to be looking for the places where God actually shows up in our lives. Uh, Wish you all the best. Remember, you're infinitely precious, unconditionally loved for the gift you already are. Until the next time.